Hello, this is Amy Burness from CyberArk's marketing team. I'd like to welcome you to our monthly On the Frontline Insider series. Today we are pleased to have with us CyberArk C-Cubed Alliance partner SailPoint on the panel, and the session is focused on maximizing your investments in identity governance and privileged access security. As usual, all of the attendees are on mute, and we will record the session. I will provide a link to everyone for on-demand viewing after we wrap up. We welcome your questions, and we just ask that you use the Q&A box, which is in the lower right-hand side of the screen, if you have the settings that way. We'll answer as many as we can during the session. We'll take some questions at the end of the session, and if we can't get to all of them during this time allotted, then we will certainly follow up with you offline. And with that, I would like to introduce today's panelists. We have Kevin James, Principal Tech Specialist at SailPoint. Kev has been working in the identity space for nearly 20 years, last 7 years with SailPoint, and he helps customers to understand the importance of governance over their identity resources. Most recently, he has been involved with CyberArk C-Cubed Alliance, helping get governance into the world of privileged access management. He's based in the north of England, and when he's not traveling around the world, he enjoys dismantling and assembling cars, which we had a great conversation about before the session. My colleague, Mike Wolf, is a sales engineer at CyberArk. He has spent the last 18 years working with identity, privileged access, and security products. He has primarily held roles in professional services and has worked as a solutions engineer. Mike is well-versed in compliance frameworks, including COBIT, PCI, HIPAA, and NIST. And his background in compliance helps bring a unique perspective to customer engagement. Mike has experience in large banking, government, retail, and also working with healthcare customers. So you guys are in good hands today. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thanks a lot, Amy. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into this. We all know the attack surface continues to expand across our enterprise for on-premise, cloud, hybrid environments, as well as our DevOps processes. However, though, what's increasing as well is privileged access across the enterprise. Also, with the increased interconnectivity, employees don't necessarily need to be in the same physical space, right? I work from home. I'm sure many of you all work from home. Also, business users aren't just the employees we know. It's not Jake in the next cube over or Sally down the hallway. Right now, this includes vendors, contractors, and partners. And these folks have access to applications and data from a variety of devices, including personal items they bring into work, the bring your own device scenario. Next, we can't forget about service accounts, application-to-application accounts, those non-human accounts. They all pose a risk that need to be managed. We need to be able to certify not only non-privileged accounts, but the privileged accounts as well. And at the end of the day, we need to be able to answer the question, when did we last certify our privileged accounts? Well, part of the challenge around this is that it's not uncommon for most PAM and identity governance solutions to be independently deployed. You know, heck, security teams and audit teams rarely talk to each other. And this creates a problem. I was recently reading in a Gartner report about this. They actually called it out. And the example I like to use is Debbie is a database administrator, right? And she's provided standard privileges for email, directory access, and other business applications from a standalone IGA system. Then, because of a policy, a rule, perhaps even a birthright entitlement, because Debbie is a DBA, she's provisioned with privileged access. Well, what are the implications of this reality? Well, we know securing privileged access is critical. Knowing who and what has access is vital. Gaining visibility to users and their access to applications and data starts with identity and access management. But what happens when a PAM deployment is separate from an identity governance solution? Well, let me tell you. One, we're going to see an increase in dormant and orphan privileged accounts. These unused accounts expand the attack surface. And quite frankly, hackers love these accounts as much as I love me a Snickers, okay? If you don't think you have any of these orphaned accounts or dormant accounts, you need to think again. Next, privileged entitlement creep. Now let's go back to Debbie. We know she was hired on as a database administrator, but now she's changing jobs, she's changing roles. She's a system administrator now. However, she still holds that role as a DBA. Now, on top of that, she's inherited the system administration entitlement. Now we have privileged entitlement creep. So think about this. What if a hacker was to gain Debbie's credentials? Now they have access at the system administration level as well as the database administration level. That poses a huge problem. Next, erroneous provisioning of privileged access. So if we don't have the separation of duty policies in place when provisioning new privileged access, we're going to lead to this type of scenario. And without these systems coming together, we'll lack centralized visibility, auditing, and reporting. This is part of the reason why we're here, folks. We need to be able to dig deep and find out who has access to my most sensitive credentials, my most sensitive systems. Heck, this is the focus of IG. We need to look at everything across the board from individual users as well as the company as a whole and to any contractors or vendors that are a part of this. And lastly, loss of productivity. I know for myself when I've been onboarded at different companies, it's great. I might even get my laptop on time, right? Woohoo. Oftentimes, though, I don't have access to the items that I need. So now that I basically have downtime. So if we don't incorporate privileged access management as part of the lifecycle management, we can't automate provisioning of privileged access for those new users. So if we don't do that, now they have to sit around and wait to do their jobs. So what happens when we bring these two best-of-breed products together? Well, it's nothing but magic. Holy smokes, it makes life so much easier. What we get is when we bring these two together, we're able to go ahead and provide a complete view of an identity's access and its associated privilege for non-privileged users and privileged users. We're able to improve efficiency and control of privileged accounts and access data directly through a single pane of glass. I don't have to jump through hoops to figure out who has what. Furthermore, I'm able to establish consistent governance controls to enforce users' policies and identify violations, such as separation of duty violations. I'm able to unify and centralize access certifications to mitigate risk over entitled users. Lastly, I can provide centralized administration and control over all privileged and non-privileged accounts, enabling provisioning and, more importantly, right, because we talked earlier about orphaned accounts, deprovisioning of privileged access based on the user's role or life cycle event changes. So what we're looking at here is an integration overview. And our focus right now is going to be on this area down here in the corner with the gold circle. This is our integration point. An integration point is made up of SailPoint's IdentityIQ privileged account management module and our CyberArk SCIM server that is a Java-based application conforming to the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, or SCIM standard. It allows SailPoint IdentityIQ to query and modify privileged data, such as users, groups, accounts, safes, and permissions, all through a web service interface through our REST API. Now, the requirements for our SCIM server you must be on a vault server must be at 9.x at least. We need an AIM credential provider at 9.0. And then we're also going to need our PAM module from SailPoint. And a high overview of really what that module is doing, it's unifying that lifecycle management and consistent controls over privileged accounts, which really lends itself to centralized administration of privileged access through established policies. Well, how does it do that? Okay, so what we're looking at here is a logical architecture integration. CyberArk and SailPoint integration allows us to critically identify information to be shared between CyberArk and IdentityIQ. So if we look at our diagram here, we have our password vault. If within our password vault, we have our safes. Now, for IdentityIQ, they use the word container. So containers and safes are the same thing. However, though, inside our safe, we have our users, we have our groups, we have our permissions or container ACLs, and our privileged data. All these safes then are synchronized via SCIM to IdentityIQ. Once they're in IdentityIQ, it's the exact same information, and this gives us the ability for one, provisioning and deprovisioning. I can go ahead and add a birthright entitlement if I want for onboarding new users. I get that visibility that is so crucial. I'm able to go ahead and dig down into CyberArk now and pull those users out of a vault. I can run a certification and audit them as well. It's not blind. It's not a manual process. It's all automated. So in addition, CyberArk is also going to collect privileged user data, account information, and access data, and send it over to SailPoint IdentityIQ. So together, we provide a unified single pane of glass with centralized policy-based identity governance for all identities. I can't stress all identities, including those privileged identities, those non-human identities, along with access entitlements across our enterprise. So for critical visibility and governance, we're able to go ahead and gain complete visibility to all users, including privileged users, and how they got that access and the permissions on that particular safe. We're able to aggregate saved contents beyond the accounts. We can go ahead and zoom in on the safe and pick up permissions for that safe and safe ownership. On an administration side, we have powerful search and filtering capabilities so admins can quickly query who has access, how they got that access, was it through Active Directory groups or was it direct access? And from this information, we can start refining our groups perhaps, and maybe it can simplify our group structure. The point of governance is to establish the right level of access to minimize risk. So how can we reduce risk? Well, one, we certify that users have the right access to the right safes. Next, we consolidate certifications for privileged and non-privileged users. So in the case of a supervisor-oriented campaign, we want the supervisor looking at the standard and privileged accounts. So why is that important? Well, the key here is to be mindful of certification exhaustion. We don't want this person to go ahead and have to run 2 certifications, one on privileged, one on non-privileged, and then try to keep up with this pace. What that's going to lead to, is certification exhaustion. That leads to rubber stamping. That leads to perhaps a lackadaisical attitude towards it. What we want to do is we want to hit that balance point of what is appropriate certification frequency depending on the access and then what is too much. We want to go ahead and look at the standard users and the privileged access users in one certification. So it makes this process much more efficient. And then shifting gears over to how can we simplify, centralize administration, we're going to eliminate waiting for privileged access by synchronizing lifecycle events, whether it's a joiner, a mover, or a leaver, now we're able to keep up with the speed of business. I don't have people sitting on the bench not working. We're able to go ahead and mitigate entitlement creep in those orphan privileged accounts. Okay, referencing Debbie, you know, how she was able, if we gave her those entitlements across system administration and database administration, now she's overprivileged. And we also don't forget those orphaned accounts. Lastly, we're able to go ahead and reduce error-prone fulfillment with automated provisioning. As we automate more, as we're getting it right, we have the ability to remove human error in the life cycle. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Kev for a demo, and he's going to show us some of this magic.
That screen. So hopefully you guys can see my screen now.
Yes.
Excellent. So thanks again, Mike. This is the home page for IdentityIQ. So when you have IdentityIQ running in your organization, you'll see something similar to this. This is populated with our demo data, so you can see that not only do we look after that privileged access, but we also do some other things like watching for users who have access to sensitive data on multiple file systems. We also do some data governance. You can see we have a couple of little widgets that show how far certain certification campaigns that you're controlling have been gone. But we'll come back to certifications in a minute. Now, one of the things that Mike mentioned was the fact that we want to be able to control not only that privileged access, which is very important in itself, but also the non-privileged access for our users. And we want, ideally, we want to be able to see all of that information in one place. So IdentityIQ has the concept of what we call an identity cube, and these are stored in the warehouse. So if I go over here, if I have the correct permissions, which I do, I can see a list of all the users in the system. And if I pick on, say, Amy Cox, she looks quite risky. The risk score she has is quite high, so we can go and drill in and have a look at her accesses. Now, this is what we call the front face of the cube. We call it the cube because it's a 360-degree view of the access that somebody has across your entire organization. So when we first look at Amy, this front face, if you will, has we've just picked out certain pieces of information so we can identify her at a glance. We know her name's Amy, she reports to Maria White, and she's an accounts payable analyst. So if we want to look at that access that she has, we go to the entitlements tab, and here you can see we have both roles and entitlements. Now, roles within IdentityIQ are essentially bundles of access. So if you know that to do a particular job function or as a member of a particular department, you need 3 AD group memberships, a couple of database accesses, and something on the ERP system, then if you know that everybody would need that, we can generate a role. So coming back to Mike's point about certification fatigue and trying to keep things as simple for users to help the organization keep compliant, we allow them to, instead of certifying 10 different groups, we allow them to certify the role. So here you can see that Amy has the role accounts payable accountant. That's been assigned to her because of her job title. So we can do automated assignment when she joins the company. And the other thing, deprovisioning. So deprovisioning, I would say, is arguably as or more important than provisioning, because you don't want people to have that access that they shouldn't have into systems. So because these are assigned by a rule that's based on the job title, as soon as Amy moves into a different department or changes her job, then we will automatically remove that access that she has and provision the new access. So she can be effective in her new job role immediately without maintaining that entitlement creep from her previous roles. Obviously, not everything will fit into a role. There'll be some ad hoc accesses, and these come down into the entitlement section. So we can see that there's a couple of groups she's a member of. she's a member of quantity surveying on the ERP system. And also here she has access to a couple of areas on the file system. So this is showing that we can see access to file systems as well as group memberships and such. We can also see a list of the accounts that she has. We can drill into those and see all the information we know about her accounts. And lastly, this is probably why she's she's got quite a high risk score. She has a policy violation. So the organization says that non-employees, Amy's a contractor, non-employees shouldn't have access to financially sensitive data, and it appears that she has. So that's obviously something that will be flagged up to somebody who's responsible for this policy, and they'll be able to change her access appropriately. Now, that was just kind of a bit of a background into the holistic view that SailPoint gives you across all the estate in your organization. But specifically today, we're talking about privileged access management. So what we do with the SCIM server that Mike mentioned is we call out to that and pull in, we ask it for all the accounts that CyberArk know about, all the containers, what access or what permissions people have on those safes. And then we model all that within the same cube, same account structure that we have for everything else. But in terms of looking at the models of the safes themselves, we just go to this, under Manage Access, we go to this Privileged Account Management link, and that shows us the 4 safes that I have in my demo environment. I haven't managed to flesh out the data much yet. But I have created one for this fictional project that we're having in the company called Project X Passwords. And this page gives us a little overview of the number of identities and groups and privileged items that are in it. I click on the button, we can go in. There's a couple of tabs here under identities. So we have direct and effective access. So as would be obvious, direct access is people who have actually had permissions assigned to their accounts on this particular safe. And if I drill into, say, Adam, I can click on the I, and you can see that he's got these 5 permissions in on the Project X Passwords safe. Now, one thing to note is that these are kind of the most granular permissions on CyberArk. There is a way to configure the system such that if you know that, say for example, list, retrieve and use password are always granted together on a particular safe, and that would quantify, the basic access in your organization, you can configure the SCIM server on both sides to just pull back one permission called basic access. And then when you provision or deprovision that, the SCIM server, the CyberArk SCIM server, will know that it needs to take away those 3 granular permissions on the system, which again is trying to make it more friendly and more easy to use for access request and certification. Because the easier you make these things, the more likely it is that people are going to help to remain compliant. We go to the effective access tab. We can see that there's another bunch of people who have effective access. So this is access that is granted through group membership. In this case, it's AD groups. And so the AD groups are granted permissions within the CyberArk vault, and then we can see those. So if I click on Mary Johnson, she has quite a few permissions. Some of these have been granted by membership of the group Project X admins. Some of them are granted by 2 separate groups. So Project X admins and Project X users both have the events list permission. And then if we go to the other list, you can see some of the usability related permissions like retrieve and use password are just granted by the Project X users. But Mary both uses this safe and she administers it, so she has a combination of permissions on this safe. We can also look at those groups and see how they were, how those permissions are modeled. So if we click on the group, we can see the identities that are members of that group. We can also see the permissions that this group grants on this particular safe, and there's quite a few on this page. And then all permissions are all the permissions on all the different safes that we see. So if this Project X admins group had permissions on another container or another safe, sorry, we would be able to see them in this list. But with my small demo data, we don't have that. Lastly, we can see the privileged items. Now, the security-minded amongst you, and hopefully that is everybody on this call, will think, oh, why are we pulling all the privileged items out of the vault? Now, we're not actually pulling the credential, the secret bit that we're not pulling out the privileged credential. We just want to know what the name of the item is and what type it is. This is just so when somebody's been asked to approve a request to grant access to this safe, if they're unsure whether somebody should have it or not, they can actually drill in and see what credentials this provides and then decide from there whether that person should have access to the safe or not. So we're helping to drive those governance decisions by pulling all these different pieces of information from the vault. Talking of requesting access, if we go back to the Identities tab, there's a button here that says Add Identities, and this is how we can make those requests for access. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a request for Brandon. The type ahead list here, as you type it, narrows it down more and more until you find the person you're looking for. So we select Brandon, and then we go into the permissions. Now we can actually restrict the number of permissions. Say, for example, you didn't want anybody to be able to create a folder or delete a folder on any safe. You can remove those at a much higher level, and they'll never appear to be requested. So it's very configurable. But I'm going to do the standard list retrieve and use password. And once I've selected the permissions I want, I hit submit. You can see the chosen identities have been submitted for addition. So what's happening now is it's going away and looking for Brandon's manager, who's a guy called Douglas, and it's going to send him what we call a work item. So Douglas is now going to be asked to do some governance. He's going to be saying whether Brandon can actually have this access or not. So if I switch to my other browser, you can see I'm logged in as Douglas, and if I refresh the screen, you can see I have an approval to do. Click on the link. This is the list of work items. So this is kind of a list of all the actions that I have to do within IdentityIQ. It could be I need to do some certification. It could be, as it is here, an approval. It could be that somebody's violating a policy and I need to know whether, I need to decide whether to allow an exception for a certain amount of time. Maybe they're covering somebody for vacation, or whether I'm going to do some action which will mitigate that, which will fix that policy violation by taking some of their access away. But if I just click on here to view, we're going to get an overview of the request. You can see here we've requested it for Brandon. It's on the container project text password, and here are the permissions I requested. I could actually forward that if I wanted to. So if I'm not sure if somebody should have it, I can forward to another person in the organization. That can be turned on and off depending on your corporate policies. But here I'm going to go ahead and approve that. Now it says I've finished all my actions. So I'm going to complete that. What's happening now is, because I've approved that, the engine within IdentityIQ is sending that off to our provisioner. And what our provisioner does is it takes the request that we've made and converts it into the relevant language for the target system. So what we're doing here is we're taking that container name and those permissions, we're converting it into a SCIM message with our SCIM connector, sending that over to CyberArk SCIM server, which will then take that message, it will understand that, and then run some Packler commands in order to update the vault. So now, if we go back to the browser, and here's my, here I am logged into the web access for the vault. If I go and look at my safes, here's project text password. If I look at the members, here we can see that Brandon has actually been granted those three permissions on this safe. And that's also reflected in this list here. If I refresh this page, there's Brandon on the Project X passwords. I would see that he's been granted those permissions. Now, coming back to something Mike was talking about, and a subject very dear to my heart, deprovisioning. We want to make sure people don't have this access any longer than they need to. And one of the ways we do that within IdentityIQ is regular certifications. So I actually have one here that's staged, which basically means I can look at it and see whether it's got the right contents or not. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use it as a template, just so I can rerun it again with the new contents. I'm going to run it now. And I'm going to look at both privileged and non-privileged accounts. So I'm going to look at Active Directory and Track as well as CyberArk. We'll turn the staging period off, and something called process revokes immediately. Now, I could do a whole hour presentation on certifications and how to set them up and how to respond to them, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and run that. We can see the latest certification is active now. If I go back to Douglas now has an access review to do. There's one laying around for my testing, but this is the latest one that we've got to do. If we start this, here you can see we've grouped up the entitlements that all the different users have. So we're looking at Adam. Adam has a number of permissions on the PAM server. Brandon here has some others. Looks like I didn't quite clean up properly after my previous run through this. So I should be able to revoke those two permissions, and hopefully my demo will still work. When I save that, what I'm going to do is, because I've revoked those permissions, I've said he doesn't need them anymore. We're going to go through that same process. We're going to send those over to the provisioner, which is going to send them through one of our connectors in a way that the target system understands. So we're going to send a skim message over to the the skim server, which will remove those permissions from the vault. And if we keep our fingers crossed and we go over to the safe and then we hit refresh, yes, we can see that those two permissions I revoked have been removed from Brandon on the vault. So certification is a process that organizations typically go through on a regular basis. And you can see how we can do that governance through certification. We can also do it through, as Mike mentioned, birthright provisioning. So what we do is we use rules to automatically assign and remove access, such as job title. So if we were to do something where Brandon moved jobs and he didn't need access to the Project X safe anymore, then we would remove it. And also, if we were to remove him from the group through access request, then that would also remove those permissions. So there are a number of ways that fit in with the governance processes of your organization to govern both privileged and non-privileged access across your entire estate. And I think on that note, I am going to hand back to Amy and Mike for Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Mike, I'll give you the presenter privileges. While that's transferring over, for those who joined late, I will just remind everyone that yes, indeed, the session today has been recorded, and the link will be available for you to watch on demand. I think it was also mentioned earlier, maybe in the session earlier today, that integration, information, and materials about SailPoint CyberArk are available on our new marketplace. So if you go to CyberArk's homepage and you look at the navigation bar at the top, you'll see something that says Marketplace, and from there you can have information about SailPoint integration and many others that are available, but you'll get the details from there. All right, so moving on to questions. Okay, can you once again address what versions of both products are needed for this integration?
Okay, I'll address the CyberArk requirements. So for CyberArk, your vault needs to be at least to 9.x. And we need the AIM credential provider to be at least at 9.x as well, and to pilot our command line interface as a version of 7.2.
Okay, and for SailPoint?
I can answer that, Kevin, real quick. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
IdentityIQ needs to be at least at 7.2 patch 2, and the PAM module is needed as well.
Yeah, so I think it may work with one of the 7.1 patches, but I'm not sure. I know I've been using it with 7.2. And yes, you do need the PAM module, which is a separate license above IdentityIQ.
Yeah.
And while you're talking about version, I was going to say maybe you can also address licensing requirements while you're at it.
Yeah, I can take that. Yes, there is there's a I think it's per server license for the IdentityIQ PAM module. It's definitely not per seat. And for the CyberArk side, there's no licensing implications for the SCIM server itself. It's freely available from support.cyberark.com if you have an access to that. Now, the one thing is that it does require AIM, the Application Identity Manager, which is a licensable component. I think that's per server license. Is that right, Mike?
Yes.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. There was a question asked earlier. I'm not sure it was fully addressed during the presentation. Non-human accounts were mentioned earlier. SailPoint and other IG systems typically make use of highly privileged accounts. What is there on the integration of SailPoint and CyberArk for managing these accounts SP uses to connect to downstream systems?
So that's a good question. In 7.3, which is out soon-ish, there will be credential cycling built in so that we can actually use the CyberArk vault itself to store the credentials for those accounts that we are using to connect into, AD or Oracle or any other connected system. So instead of having to enter a hard-coded password into the application definition and then update that when you cycle the password, we'll actually be cycling those on a regular basis with a service that runs inside IdentityIQ. So that's in the next version.
Another question is, does 7.2 offer a static connector into CyberArk for certifications only, not intended for provision or for deprovisioning?
So essentially a read-only connector. I think that was what I understood from the question.
Yes, he replied.
Yeah, so it's definitely possible to set it up that way. We need to dig into, well, basically you don't configure what we call the provisioning policies. So without going into too much detail and getting sidetracked, for each application that we have, we can configure provisioning policies that tell the system what attributes to send over when we want to create an object, delete an object, rename, move, update. And so basically you could just delete those from the application config, and then it wouldn't know how to provision. So you would just essentially be turning it off.
Okay, thank you for that. Kev, this one is also for you, asking, is it possible to create an application in IQ that retrieves just a specific set of safes from CyberArk?
So I would say it's possible to achieve that outcome, but it wouldn't be done by creating an application in IQ. What you would do, the way the SCIM server works is it has its own account, like a service account in the CyberArk vault that it uses to pull the information out and obviously write back. So what you would do is you would just make sure that the user that service account that looked at the safes didn't have access to the ones you wanted to exclude, or rather was only given access to the ones you wanted to include. In fact, that's a good point, because my CyberArk vault has about 8 or 9 safes within it, but as you saw from the demo, there was only 4 that it pulled in, because the other ones are administrative safes that the SCIM service account doesn't have access to. So it's done through account configuration rather than configuring the app on IIQ.
Okay, great. I think we're caught up on all the questions. So at this time, I would like to thank both the panelists and in particular, Kevin, I know it's early evening for you, so thank you for joining us late from across the pond, and for everyone for your interesting questions and participation today. I would also like to remind everyone that we have a couple more important events coming up for our customers at CyberArk. We have our annual Impact Conference, which will be in Berlin next week, and then Boston in mid-July, so hopefully we'll be able to see you for one of those. And if you're interested in other integrations and, of course, the details about this one, I remind everyone to check out our marketplace, which you can access directly from the homepage of CyberArk. But again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time on the front lines.
Thank you.
Thank you.